Joining us now, as he does each and every week for a weekly talk on the markets and the economy, is Michael Greiner, Assistant Professor of Management at Oakland University. Michael, thanks for being with us.
It's great to be back, Tyler. I loved hearing you recount the history there. We've definitely seen some pretty interesting times over the past few years.
Yeah, definitely have, and are continuing to see interesting times in another way, more modernly, and that includes this continued battle here in the U.S. and around the world, but with inflation. As recently, the Federal Reserve and Chairman Jerome Powell have been keen to raise the rates a little bit lighter because inflation had not necessarily reduced, but hadn't been growing at the same rate. Now we're hearing that potentially a big interest rate hike could be coming from the Federal Reserve. What's going on in that regard?
Yeah, this has been kind of a frustration for everybody involved in this, including, I think, Chairman Powell. Because of the fact that we were hoping that we were coming down to a slowdown in inflation. It appeared to be that way. But what really shocked everyone, of course, and we talked about this in a prior episode, was the big jobs report that we got for last month. That was just unbelievable, far beyond what anybody expected, with over 500,000 new jobs created. And it showed that wages were going up pretty aggressively. It showed that there were still more than 2 jobs available for every person looking for a job. The unemployment rate was down to a historic low. So that was kind of a shocker. Now, most people would think, oh, that's good news. Unemployment is down. Yes, but the problem is this, is that to be able to get inflation under control, you're basically required to slow down the economy a little bit. You see, as there's more competition for these workers, they're able to bid up the wages that they're demanding from employers. And then the employers have to pass on those wages to the people who are buying the products or services. And that's a big part of where inflation comes from. Now, we are seeing a slowdown in hiring, particularly in certain industries that tend to be more goods oriented, for example, because they don't rely on workers as much. But the place we're seeing the big increases still are in retail and in services industries like travel and hospitality, that type of thing. The big things that really were shut down during COVID, and now people want to take advantage of. Well, as it turns out, just this morning, we got another jobs report. And again, it was higher than was expected, with about 311,000 new employees. And what's even more significant in some ways is that they'll frequently look back on prior reports to see if they need to adjust the data. And as it turns out, that 500,000 plus jobs report that we got last month, that pretty much stands. So it appears that we still have a very, very robust employment market. And what that does then is send a message to the Fed and to Chairman Powell in particular that we are going to have to increase interest rates even more to try to get inflation under control. So what Powell did then, last week, he actually testified twice in front of Congress, once in front of the House, once in front of the Senate, when he made it very clear that if we see a continuation of these robust employment figures, that we're likely to see faster increases on interest rates. And we had seen a slowdown of those increases. I mean, as you recall, and again, we talked about this in the past, we had 4 months in a row of 0.75% interest rate increases, which was a historic level. Then we went down to a 0.5 percentage point. Then last month we had a 0.25 percentage point increase. And we were hoping that it was going to kind of stay at that level and maybe even slow down even more from that going forward. The problem is that with these kinds of figures, it sends a message to the Fed, you need to stay aggressive on this. And the message that Chairman Powell was sending is that he's not letting up on inflation, that this is a priority for him. He's going to do whatever it takes to get inflation under control, even if it means having to basically hurt the jobs market, which is what he believes he's going to have to do at this point. So the hope is that if there's any silver lining within the jobs report that we received today, it's that it appears wages are slowing down a little bit, that there's not as much upward pressure on wage growth. But still, I mean, the unemployment rate is very low at 3.6%. As I say, we had over 300,000 new jobs created, which is above what was expected. We did have people coming off the sidelines from the economy, so more people being involved in the jobs market. So that's a positive. But still, I mean, it seems to indicate to me And this is the message that Chairman Powell was sending, is that we're not done with rate increases going forward, and we just need to accept that.
And so, as people are looking for jobs, and as employers are looking to hire people in our local area, especially in those sectors that we're seeing a real push for more employees, like you said, in retail, it brings up an interesting question, because that relationship between the job market and inflation and vice versa has been so volatile of lately. So what's really having a bigger effect? Is the job market having a bigger effect on inflation, or is inflation having a bigger effect on the job market?
That's a great question. And the problem that we've been dealing with really ever since the COVID pandemic started, as you were talking about before the break, is that all the rules have changed. With this inflation, we had different reasons for the inflation, one right after the other. I mean, immediately after the COVID pandemic, we had the situation where we had the supply chains all snarled because everybody had gotten used to ordering one kind of product as a result of the pandemic, and then they wanted to change what they were ordering as a result of them people going back out to gyms and that type of thing. So that changed all the dynamics there, and they had to restructure the supply chains quite a bit, and that caused all those problems. Then, of course, we had energy prices going up as a result of the invasion in Ukraine, and that then caused a problem for a while. Well, that has also gotten under control more than we had seen in the past. And so those seem like good signs, but the problem is that then it kind of started to gin up the employment market, and we've seen such robust growth in the employment market that really it's been quite surprising. I don't think anybody expected that things would continue for as long as they have. We expected that there'd be a rapid jump back in employment right after the COVID recession, but since then we've seen these robust numbers one month after another, after another, after another, and it just shows that in some fundamental ways the economy has changed, and that's, I think, what is making it so hard for economists as a group and the Fed chairman himself to kind of get our minds around what exactly is going on. And part of the problem, he even said this in his testimony. He was challenged by one of the senators, I believe it was Elizabeth Warren, who said, "Hey, what do you say to people who are might lose their jobs as a result of these interest rate increases? How can you justify to them that you're throwing them out of a job to try to get this inflation under control?" And he said, "Look, we are hampered by the fact that we have only certain limited tools at our disposal to be able to address this. And these tools are not perfect, but they're the only way that we have of addressing inflation. And as it turns out, inflation is a burden on everybody, including working people who've seen much of their wages getting eaten up by inflation, where they're not able to buy as much as they were able to in the past with the wages that they're receiving. So even if they are receiving wage increases, which many people have been as a result of this robust employment market, they've been seeing that their money just hasn't been going as far. So that's kind of the challenge that I think Chairman Powell, the Fed, and economists generally are facing right now, which is we are dealing with this just strange economy right now, and all the rules are broken right now. So we're just trying to kind of muddle our way through.
Yeah, it's really trying to understand all these different compounding issues that are affecting one another, and it's just this big knot that it seems they're trying to untangle, while also taking care of some of the basics, or trying to address some of the basics of inflation that have affected our economy in the past. Because we've seen, even in the last few times we've had inflation be so high, that's caused costs of business to be so high that employment has gone down. This time around, employment has actually gone up, and we're seeing more people
that's the crazy thing. Yeah,
right.
And the hope is that we'll be able to engineer what they call a soft landing, where we don't have this big increase in unemployment, but yet we're able to kind of get inflation under control. Who knows, though? I mean, that could happen, but it's hard to say right now, just because, again, the rules have changed.
Michael Greiner is an assistant professor of management at Oakland University School of Business Administration and joins us weekly on the Megacast to talk about the markets and the economy here in the U.S., and especially here in the state of Michigan. He talked about a soft landing from inflation, a not so soft landing in the attempt to merge for JetBlue and Spirit Airlines, trying to keep their costs low as people are enjoying their spring breaks right around now and hoping that next year or in the future those flight prices could be even lower. What's going on in that case, and what ultimately has led to the Justice Department saying, "No go on this, we're canceling your flight"?
Yeah, great question. And anybody who's been searching for airfares recently knows how high airfares have gotten. On a real basis, they are very high right now, and that has to do with the fact that there is this robust demand again coming out of the recession, where people who were stopped from traveling for years actually are suddenly saying, hey, I've got these savings, I want to go out and be able to enjoy them and do the things that I was restricted from doing during the pandemic. Well, a big part of that, of course, is travel. The problem that we've got, though, is that we've got a very, very consolidated air travel market right now. Over 80% of the market is controlled by just four airlines, of course. And those are Delta, which is the big one here in Detroit. And then you've got United, American, and Southwest. And between those three, they control 8 out of 10 flights going on in the country. Now, to try to respond to that, then you've got JetBlue, which has been growing pretty robustly across the country, especially though in the Northeast and in Florida. And what they have done to try to address this is they've actually tried a couple times to merge with another airline. Their first attempt was to merge with oh boy, I'm blanking out on the name of it, a Virgin America, which was based out in San Francisco, but they lost out on that to Alaska Airlines, which ended up going forward with that merger. So then they turned their attention to Spirit Airlines. Now, Spirit Airlines, in some respects, is very different from JetBlue. Anybody who's flown on Spirit Airlines or been exposed to it knows just how serious they are about their low-cost model. I mean, they offer ridiculously low prices. Sometimes I've seen prices as low as $9 each way. But what those prices buy you is nothing. I mean, they buy you basically, you get on the airplane. If you want to bring on anything more than just a bag that you're able to put in the seat in front of you, you have to pay for it. If you want to have any food, you have to pay for it. If you want to have the ticket agent print out your boarding pass, you have to pay for it. They literally charge for every extra, whereas JetBlue has more oriented itself kind of like along the lines of the more traditional airlines, where they offer this package deal where they'll include certain things in with the cost. They'll include certain baggage in with the cost that you're paying, and they have certain entertainment on the flights. All things that you don't see on Spirit Airlines. Now, initially, there had been an offer and an agreement, actually, that Spirit would merge with Frontier, which is an airline much more like Spirit, kind of that ultra low cost model. And the only other major airline at this point that's really following that model is Allegiant. So you're talking really a small group of airlines that have focused then on trying to deliver the absolute lowest prices with no frills whatsoever, very small seats, very little leg room to people who are very price sensitive. That's again not the area that JetBlue is trying to target. So that's where this merger is kind of surprising. But now, that being said, the Justice Department is saying, look, we already have a consolidated industry with four carriers holding 80% of the industry. If we allow this merger, yes, JetBlue would grow, and they'd only grow to be about 10% of the market, but still that would mean that 5 airlines would control 90% of the US airline market, which is just too much consolidation. Part of the problem, I think, is that we did have these mega mergers in the past. And of course, one that affected us here in Detroit was the mega merger between Delta and Northwest, where Northwest used to have the big hub here in Detroit that many people may remember. Well, a lot of those mergers were done where there were these behavioral agreements that were made between the Department of Justice and the merging companies, where the airlines would say, okay, we'll let go of certain slots that we have at some of these airports, or some of the gates that we have at some of these airports, to try to encourage competition. Because the real risk when you have these big mergers and you have so much consolidation is that you lose the competition for fares. Competition is what's going to generate lower prices, and it's also what's going to generate innovation. That is because of this competition that firms look to provide better services at lower costs, and that they find ways of doing that, because without those pressures going down, there's really no motivation for the companies to do so. So there's really been a push by this administration, and it's really been something that economists like myself have been urging for a long time, to try to get more hardcore on antitrust law and to try to stop some of these mergers from going through, because all they do is just make it so that consumers are impacted in the long run, and we have less access to the choices that we had in the past. Well, again, the problem is that the horse has left the barn. Again, this is an example of where the administration has imperfect tools available to it. I'm sure their preference would have been to try to block one of these mega mergers that happened a few years ago, but they can't do that. They're over. So what they have available now is this merger. And so they're going to try to focus on it and say enough consolidation is enough. We're going to stop this consolidation in the airline industry. And they're sending a message both to this industry and others, which are that you can't basically consolidate your way out of competition and create a market where people no longer have the choices available to them that they'd like to have.
Michael, this week, Wednesday, we once again celebrated International Women's Day, and a critical issue for women in our economy over the last decades, really, has been closing the pay gap, or really closing it entirely between what women make and their hourly wages or yearly wages in comparison to men. Now, lately, over the last several years, especially with diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts being a critical part of many businesses and their plans for the future, those gaps have been closed entirely, or at least partially, by some of these companies throughout the U.S. and right here in Michigan. But by and large, where are we at in terms of the gender wage gap that tends to have men being paid several cents more per hour than women on average?
Yeah, as it turns out, you're right that if you look at individual companies, and certainly here in Michigan, you've seen a lot of it, where they've done a great job in trying to address this gender pay gap. But the reality is, when you look at the numbers overall across our country and globally, even the progress has kind of stalled over the last 20 years or so. I remember back in the early 80s and even in the 1970s. I'm dating myself here a little bit, but I remember when it was not uncommon for employers to say, hey, we need to pay the man more because of the fact that he's got to take care of his family. Well, fortunately, those days are gone. And any situation where you see an employer directly paying an employee, if it be a woman, less for the same job, then that's going to be illegal. And there have been lawsuits filed. And as a result, employers really tend to be very careful policing themselves to make sure that when you have two people doing essentially the same job, if it's a man and a woman, that they're paid the same. And that just makes sense. So that's where we made a lot of progress through the 80s and 90s. But again, that seems to have stalled here in the 2000s. And it's when you look at the average wages overall. Now, there are some economists who will argue that when you control for certain factors, basically when you look at what is causing this gap, and then you try to use mathematical tools to isolate which factors are causing this, you can actually pretty much identify what those are. And they tend to be things like different jobs that they're in, different industries that they're in. That women tend to be consolidated in lower paying industries, lower paying jobs. That women also tends to take time off to care for children or elderly relatives. And as a result, they'll have gaps in their employment. That women tend to have a less robust network that they're able to rely upon to help them find higher paying jobs and to help them get into the higher levels of management, for example. And that's all true. But what something that I've argued, a number of other economists have argued, is that doesn't solve the problem. It's not enough to simply say, oh, women do different jobs from men, and so it's okay that they're paid less overall. What we need to do now is address more, I think, the society-wide institutional issues that are out there. Why are, for example, these industries that tend to be dominated by women paid less than industries that tend to be dominated by men? As you asked earlier with the question about jobs and inflation, you have to ask yourself, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Are these industries dominated by women because they're paid less, or are they paid less because they're dominated by women? And my guess is that you probably have a little bit of both. But I think that now we're going to have to go through some efforts in society where we do some fundamental rethinking of our relationship with work, where we make it, for example, more socially acceptable for men also to take time off to care for children and elderly relatives. So women are able to continue their careers without interruption. or at least that responsibility is balanced somewhat. Also, that certain industries that tend to be more female dominated, that they also tend to be paid at the equivalent level of other industries, which tend to be more male oriented. So I think that that's going to be a process that our country is going to have to go through. But it's important that we do so, because one study I saw said that as much as $7 trillion a year is lost worldwide as a result of the gender pay gap. That's basically the amount of money that would be gained if women were being fully paid what men are being paid on average. And if that happens, you could just imagine all the more money that would be available in our economy to be able to generate jobs and generate economic activity. And unfortunately, it's being limited by the fact that we still have some pretty old-fashioned perceptions of the way things are supposed to be, and that those perceptions are translating into some real factors then that you see reflected in the job market.
Well, Michael, we appreciate you joining us as always to talk about what's going on in our economy and in the markets, and how all these different factors continue to tighten that ball of yarn that we're trying to untangle here in our economy.
It's great to be here, Tyler. Thanks for having me, and try to be careful out there on those roads.